Hello, I'm Jeremy, and welcome to another episode of RevUs Reviews. Most TV shows, no matter how good, have a few bad episodes, and unfortunately, The Twilight Zone is no exception. For every 50 great Twilight Zone episodes, there's about one or two bad ones, and they deserve to be talked about too. So instead of talking about the best episodes of The Twilight Zone, like I did in my last episode, I'm going to count down my pick for the top 10 worst episodes of The Twilight Zone. And before we start, if one of your favorite Twilight Zone episodes ends up on this list, remember, this is just my opinion. And if I don't have one of your least favorite episodes, comment below. Now let's get started. Number 10, The Whole Truth. I actually really like this episode. So why is it on my worst list? Because it's one of the stupidest episodes of The Twilight Zone ever made. The episode revolves around a car salesman named Harvey Honeycutt, who's basically every fictional car salesman ever. One day, an old man brings a Model A car into Harvey's establishment, and Harvey proceeds to buy it from the old man, despite his warnings that the car is haunted. After he buys the car, Harvey discovers that because of the car, he loses the ability to lie. This not only decreases his customer quota, but also gets him in trouble with his wife and gets him a punch in the face from his assistant Irv. This episode is one of the silliest to come out of The Twilight Zone. It doesn't even attempt to take itself seriously. The music is corny, and the acting and dialogue are straight out of I Love Lucy. Also, Harvey is a pretty funny character. He's an incredibly two-dimensional car salesman stereotype, but what makes him great is the guy who plays him, Jack Carson. Carson does a really good job capturing the sleaziness and mannerisms of the character. And having it be a car salesman is pretty clever, as they have a reputation for lying. But by far the best part of this episode is the ending, where Harvey ends up selling the haunted car to, no joke, Nikita Khrushchev. And while that is a spoiler, it's just too gloriously stupid not to mention. So yeah, The Whole Truth is more so bad it's good than plain bad. I highly recommend checking this episode out, as it's so stupid, corny, and silly that it's actually enjoyable. The Whole Truth simply has to be seen to be believed. Number 9, Sounds and Silences. To give this episode credit, the premise for it isn't actually a bad one. It's about a man named Roswell G. Flemington, who loves loud noises because his mother required silence in his house because she was ill. After his wife leaves him to get away from all his noise, Flemington becomes obsessive and begins to hear every noise, no matter how small. He goes to a psychiatrist who tells him his conflict with his wife is causing him to think he has his mother's illness and tells Flemington to use mind over matter to cure himself. However, this works too well as Flemington loses the ability to hear anything. With the right people on board, this episode could have been a typical Twilight Zone morality tale. A man who annoys everyone with his favorite thing loses the ability to enjoy that favorite thing. And there are a lot of pluses to this episode. It does a really good job showing Flemington's sound obsession by amplifying the noises so we can feel his pain. And Flemington is also a really good, funny character. Like Carson from the previous episode, John MacGyver does a great job hamming it up as Roswell G. Flemington. The only real problem with this episode is its incredibly corny delivery. The episode executes it in an enjoyable fashion, unlike my number 6 pick for this list. But the problem is a premise like this needs to be treated seriously. A car that causes its owner to lose the ability to lie is a dumb premise, so it's fine for it to be handled in a corny way. But this is a premise that could have put Sounds and Silences in the ranks of episodes like Time Enough at Last and To Serve Man. So this episode isn't that bad, it just could have been better. Oh, and Flemington mentions that his mother was so averse to noise, she would serve brownies instead of cookies because they made less noise when you chewed them. I really wish I was making that up. Number 8. Cavender is Coming. Cavender is Coming is actually a backdoor pilot for a completely different show. And seeing as you most likely never even heard of this episode, you can tell how successful that was. The episode is about a woman named Agnes Grepp, played by Carol Burnett. Yes, that Carol Burnett. Grepp works in a movie theater and she's a massive klutz, making her job really hard. However, she soon gets help from the titular Cavender, played by the Maytag repair guy, a guardian angel signed to assist her. This episode is way too corny for its own good. Unlike the previous 2 episodes, which, despite their corniness, still take themselves seriously in the story department, this episode is just fluff. The dialogue is corny and stupid, the humor is incredibly broad and dumb, and the music is incredibly silly. That being said, the acting is pretty good. Cavender and Grepp are both played by really good actors and work well off each other. Also, the other actors are pretty good too. And like The Whole Truth, this episode is so bad it's good. In fact, it makes The Whole Truth look like Macbeth in comparison. It's so silly, dumb, and ridiculous that it sticks out like a sore thumb in the massive sea that is the Twilight Zone. And while it was meant to be a different series, it's just way too stupid and cheesy to capture mainstream audiences. Although I personally think this would have made a great series. Now you're probably thinking that I've been really lenient on these first 3 episodes. Well, that's because the Twilight Zone isn't like most other series. While there are episodes of the Twilight Zone that are terrible in their own right, most Twilight Zone episodes are just not good by Twilight Zone standards. In fact, a lot of the episodes I thought were going to be terrible were in reality too meh to make this list. There are a lot of Twilight Zone episodes, so in picking the worst of the worst, you sometimes have to go with the only okay. Also because I really wanted to talk about The Whole Truth. But now, it's time to get to the truly terrible episodes. Starting with number 7, The Bard. Most Twilight Zone fans agree that Season 4 is the worst season of the Twilight Zone. In fact, it's the only season that's not on Netflix. And while the 4th season had some major stinkers like Jessie Belle and I Dream of Jeannie, by far the stupidest was the episode the season ended on, known as The Bard. The episode revolves around a screenwriter named Julius K. Moomer, whose scripts keep getting rejected. However, his boss gives him a chance in the form of a TV series about black magic. Moomer gets a book about black magic from a local bookstore in order to use it for research, and accidentally uses it to conjure up William Shakespeare, who is willing to do anything Moomer asks of him. This episode is incredibly dumb. It has the same problems as Cavender is Coming, except it's somehow both more and less corny than that episode. The acting is bad, except from Shakespeare. The tone is way too goofy, even in comparison to the previous 3 episodes on this list. And Moomer is an annoying, obnoxious dunderhead who, while not unlikable, is creatively bankrupt and not worth sympathizing with. Oh, and the ending is absolutely stupid. The only interesting things about this episode are Moomer and Shakespeare's interactions, specifically how Shakespeare's professional, classy attitude clashes with Moomer's casual, laid-back attitude, how Moomer's black magic book just flies off the shelf with the head of the bookstore not even recognizing it, which is actually pretty clever and could have been used in a much better Twilight Zone episode, and the fact that Burt Reynolds is in this episode. Other than that, it's pretty stupid and ridiculous. Number 6, The Mighty Casey. If you wanted an episode more corny and less fun than The Whole Truth, this episode is for you. The Mighty Casey is about a baseball team called the Hoboken Zephyrs, who has a lot of failing players. The manager of the team, Mouth McGarry, signs on a new pitcher named Casey, who is a robot. Naturally, Casey is amazing at baseball, so McGarry makes a deal with Casey's creator, Dr. Stillman, to sign Casey to his team. Similar to The Whole Truth, the premise is absolutely corny, and the episode doesn't take itself seriously. However, The Mighty Casey is just really dumb. It doesn't even feel like anything from the Twilight Zone, and it's a really boring episode. That being said, the acting is pretty good, especially from the 3 main characters. Robert Sorrells is really good at playing a robot, Jack Warden is good at capturing the characteristics and mannerisms of a stereotypical baseball coach, and Abraham Sofer does a good job as Dr. Stillman. However, this episode is just plain terrible. It's somehow both corny and boring. If you're a baseball fan, you might like this episode, but if not, give this one a skip. Number 5, The Bewitching Pool. You'd think that for the final episode of The Twilight Zone, they'd go out of their way to make it gripping, thought-provoking, and amazing. Sadly, they did not. The Bewitching Pool is about 2 kids named Jeb and Sport, yes, that's seriously their names, whose parents, Gil and Gloria Sherwood, are incredibly apathetic and uncaring. Jeb and Sport are hanging out by their pool when all of a sudden they see a kid floating in the pool who beckons them to follow him. They oblige and end up in a strange land with a bunch of other kids and a kind old woman named Aunt T, no relation to Mr. T. While the plot for this episode isn't necessarily a bad one, it's extremely bogged down by numerous things. The characters are really boring. The episode doesn't take itself seriously, but not in a fun way like The Whole Truth or Cavender is Coming, and the dialogue is really awful. And the acting. Dear God, the acting in this is terrible. These actors make Tommy Wiseau look like a trained thespian. And sure, child actors aren't always great, but these kids don't even try to make a competent performance. And the actors playing Gil and Gloria are absolutely horrendous. Their dialogue is terrible, and their acting is James Nguyen movie levels of bad. The only good things about this episode are Aunt T, who's really kind and sweet, and surprisingly the episode doesn't have a twist where she's revealed to actually be evil the whole time, so props for not going through with a common cliche, and the narration of Rod Serling, which is fantastic as usual. But unfortunately, those 2 aren't enough to save this awful ending to an amazing series. Also, fun fact, Sport is voiced, yes voiced, by June Foray, the voice of Rocket T. Squirrel, which is why she sounds like if Rocky had a southern accent. Number 4, Execution. Like Sounds and Silences, Execution has a good idea, but fails in the delivery. The episode is about a Western criminal named Joe Caswell, who's about to be hanged. Suddenly, Joe disappears before the rope tightens enough to kill him. He wakes up years in the future in the house of a scientist named Professor Mannion, played by the professor from Gilligan's Island. Mannion tells Joe that he was brought here through the power of his time machine and that he intends to study Joe. While Joe accepts, he's still very distrustworthy of Mannion, and Mannion has the same attitude towards Joe. At first, the episode looks like it follows through with its interesting premise, by having a suspenseful atmosphere, good pacing, and two very interesting characters. But it all falls apart once Mannion discovers who Joe really is. After this point, the episode just kind of meanders along and just rushes through things. Also, I don't really understand Mannion's decision to send Joe back. Yeah, he's a criminal, but you have the first time-traveling human being and you're just gonna throw him away? Wouldn't it make more sense to try and reform Joe and try to get him used to the modern world and becoming a better person? That would have been a much more interesting story than, "You're a crook, you must die. No, you must die. Bam!" And Mannion is an absolute idiot. While it isn't explained exactly how he took Joe, it appears that he just set his time machine to a random time period and to pick a random person, which is absolutely stupid. Even if he didn't end up bringing back Joe, he could have brought someone even more dangerous like Hitler or Stalin, not to mention the numerous time paradoxes that most likely occurred through Joe's disappearance. And while the ending is kind of clever, it's really rushed, needlessly dark, and as satisfying as watching an Amy Schumer movie. Bottom line, this episode is not good. If you want to watch a better version of this episode, watch Once Upon a Time, which I talked about in my last video. But if you want an interesting story that takes its time and feels complete, this episode is not for you. Number 3. Come Wander With Us. While The Bewitching Pool was the last episode of The Twilight Zone to be broadcast, Come Wander With Us was the final episode of The Twilight Zone to officially be made. And it's an even worse series finale than The Bewitching Pool. The episode is about a man named Floyd Burney, a folk singer who's looking for a new tune. He stops at a store run by an old man who kind of looks like Leonard Nimoy. Burney asks Leonard Nimoy guy to tell him how to write a good song, but he refuses to say anything. Suddenly, Burney hears a beautiful song and follows the voice singing the song. He finds a girl named Mary Rachel, who the voice belonged to. He asks for the song, but Mary refuses, saying that it belongs to someone. He tells her he'll change the song a little, and in return, he'll take her away. However, his plans are crinkled when the Rayford brothers find Burney and are upset at him for singing the song and promising to take Mary away. Despite how incredibly convoluted that story was, this is probably the most boring episode of The Twilight Zone ever made. Things take forever to happen. What should take only a couple minutes, the episode stretches out so much that the viewer loses interest. Also, this episode has a very dull tone. While most other Twilight Zone episodes have an interesting or mysterious tone, or a goofy and silly tone, the tone in this episode is very slow and dull, leading to a lack of charm or interest. Oh, and the song this episode is named after sucks. I'm sure there's an audience for it, but it's so depressing sounding that it makes me gag. Although Floyd's version of the song is much more tolerable. The story is also really poorly executed. A radio that plays songs that predict the future is a good plot device, but it doesn't really work in this episode. And there's stuff that doesn't make sense, like when Floyd meets one of the Rayford brothers, he says that folks have been hearing Floyd talking about taking Mary Rachel to Norfolk, despite the fact that nobody could have heard Floyd and he didn't say anything about Norfolk. Also, it's never explained why the Raymond brothers don't want anyone to hear the song. And don't even get me started on the incredibly confusing ending. The only good thing about this episode is Floyd Burney. The guy who plays him really captures the mannerisms, voice, and attitude of a Glenn Campbell-esque country singer, and he's one of those rare characters who's not quite a bad person, but not quite a good person either. But it's not worth waiting through this boring, slow, confusing mess of an episode to get to him. Number 2, spur of the moment. As bad as the last episode was, it at least had a redeeming value in the form of its protagonist, Floyd Burney, and it had an easy-to-follow story, albeit with a few holes. Spur of the moment, on the other hand, does not. The episode is about a woman named Anne, who's riding her horse when she sees a scary-looking woman on a black horse. Black Horse Woman chases Anne, who runs away from her into her house. Anne tells her family about the woman, and they try to comfort her. Minutes later, Anne's ex-boyfriend, David Mitchell, comes in belligerently, begging for Anne to come back to him. Anne's family and her new fiancé, Robert, tell him to go away and soon force him out. 25 years later, Anne is a depressed alcoholic, and she reveals to her mother, as well as the audience, that, are you ready for this? She was the Black Horse Woman the whole time. Yes, somehow she traveled back in time, chased herself, and then just gave up chasing her to, I don't know, make a sandwich or something. And in addition to not making the slightest bit of sense, this twist doesn't play into anything. If instead of the Black Horse Woman chasing Anne, it cut to her at the house, it would make no difference. If this was a good Twilight Zone episode, it would have Black Horse Woman go back in time and give Anne a warning about the future and have her mysteriously disappear. And afterwards, because of her trying to prevent said actions, she in turn gets roped into said actions. But instead, Black Horse Woman just shouts, "Anne, wait, stop," and runs after her, glaring like a mad woman. And again, how the heck did she travel back in time? How did she figure out that she was Black Horse Woman? What on earth happened to her, and why did she stop chasing her? At least the village and the happening have twist endings that make some kind of sense. This is just dumb, stupid, and idiotic. But what about the rest of this episode? Is it any good? No! This episode is so boring. It's like if you took a soap opera and removed all of the interesting parts of it. The dialogue is boring, the acting is mediocre, and the characters are really boring, with the exception of David, but that's only because he's insane. So we have an episode that's boring, stupid, confusing, and has one of the worst twist endings I have ever seen. What episode could possibly be worse than this one? Well, you'll see as we finally get to number 1, The Chaser. This episode is absolutely awful. The plot revolves around a guy named Roger Shackelford, who's in love with a girl named Leela, who doesn't love him back. He repeatedly calls her in a phone booth, wasting everyone's time, until a man, wanting to get rid of him, gives Roger the business card of a professor named A. Damon. Yes, that's seriously his name, and suggests going to Damon to solve his problem. Damon gives Roger a love potion, and he gives it to Leela. But it works too well, and she becomes obsessed with him. The idea of a person giving someone a love potion and that person becoming insanely obsessed with them is an idea that's so played out. And while this episode was made before that plot started becoming cliche, it's way too boring a plot to be in a series as awesome as The Twilight Zone. Okay, so the plot is cliche, but is it executed in a fun, interesting way? Well, considering this is the number 1 spot in the worst Twilight Zone episodes list, you should know the answer to that question. It isn't. While it's not as boring as Come Wander With Us, The Chaser is very lackluster. There's no charm to speak of, and the story is very humdrum. Also, Roger is one of the most unlikable protagonists I've ever seen. He's a narcissistic loser who obsesses over a woman that's not even remotely interested in him. Oh, and I will remind you, he spends the first part of this episode wasting everyone's time by obsessively calling Leela. And while the episode is most likely trying to get us to hate him, it works too well. Oh, characters like Salvador Ross and Mr. Dundee from Night of the Meek are characters that, while hateable, have layers to them and are clearly intended to be hateable. Roger not only has no layers to him, but I hate him more than either of them. He's an unlikable loser who doesn't respect other people and only thinks of himself. On top of that, Leela is just as, if not more, unlikable than Roger. Sure, she doesn't love him, but she's such a condescending, stuck-up snob that I don't end up sympathizing with her. In fact, I'm more sympathetic to Roger than Leela. As much as I hate Roger, I'll be the first to admit that he deserves someone better than Leela. And the way Leela's portrayed after getting the love potion is 50s advertising levels of sexist. Yes, the potion is a love potion, but there's a difference between a girlfriend and a love slave. A difference which this episode doesn't seem to acknowledge. But wait, it gets worse. Remember when I said there was a guy in the phone booth who told Roger about A. Damon? There's 2 unanswered questions about that guy, which are infinitely more interesting than Roger's selfish quest. 1. How did he know Damon? And 2. What was his phone call about? He was so panicked about getting to the phone that he paid people in line to let him cut in front of them. There must be an interesting, important reason for that phone call. Well, guess what? We never find out what that phone call was about. Instead, we get to follow Roger the Unlikable for the rest of this stupid episode. However, to give this episode the tiniest bit of credit, I really like the character of A. Damon. He's like a grumpy Captain Manzini, and the scenes between him and Roger are pretty well done. Also, the warning he gives Roger is pretty clever. He essentially says to use the potion immediately, not because it will expire, but because if Roger doesn't use the potion immediately, then he'll lose the courage to use the potion and never use it again. But despite having an awesome character and clever idea, The Chaser is an absolutely atrocious episode. It's cliche, it's boring, it's extremely sexist, it has one of the worst protagonists I've ever seen, and it wastes 2 interesting story ideas that could have produced better episodes than this pile of garbage. And that is why The Chaser is the #1 worst episode of The Twilight Zone. That's all for now. Join me next time when we talk about a fun comedy with crazy inventions, weird jokes, and Larry Miller. See you then!